On a full moon night in the depths of a remote forest, a group of friends decides to camp, ignoring the local legends about creatures that roam in the darkness. Little did they know they were about to face an unimaginable horror, a being that defied reality itself, a bloodthirsty werewolf. The full moon hung like a vigilant eye over the Black Pines forest, its silver light barely penetrating the dense canopy of foliage. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional crackling of branches under the hesitant steps of 5 figures moving among the ancient trees. "Are you sure this is the way, Mark?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly, her green eyes scanning the restless shadows around them. Mark, a broad-shouldered young man with an easy smile, consulted his phone once more. "Relax, everyone. The GPS says the perfect clearing for camping is just about 500 meters from here." Lucas, the group's skeptic, let out an exasperated sigh. "Great. Because spending the night in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by stories of supernatural creatures, is exactly my idea of fun." "Oh, come on, Lucas," exclaimed Julia, playfully punching her friend's arm. "Where's your sense of adventure? Those legends are just stories to scare tourists." The 5th member of the group, Daniel, remained silent. His dark eyes seemed to absorb the shadows around them, as if searching for something beyond the others' comprehension. As they moved forward, the air seemed to grow thicker, laden with the smell of damp earth and something else, something wild and primal. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it promises of long-buried secrets and horrors yet to be awakened. None of them noticed the figure watching them from afar, eyes glowing with an ancient hunger in the darkness. Nor did they hear the low growl that reverberated through the underbrush, a sinister promise of the terror to come. Little did they know this night would mark their lives forever, if they survived to tell the tale. The clearing Mark had promised revealed itself to be a small paradise amid the oppressive darkness of the forest. The group quickly set up their tents and lit a campfire, its dancing flames seeming to keep the night's shadows at bay. Sitting around the crackling fire, the friends tried to dispel the tension that had built up during the hike. "So, who wants to hear a ghost story?" Julia asked, her face lit by a mischievous smile. Lucas rolled his eyes. "Please, no. We're already scared enough in this creepy place." "Oh, come on," insisted Sarah, surprising everyone with her sudden enthusiasm. "I heard some stories about this area when we were planning the trip. They say there's something strange about this forest." Daniel, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the flames. "You mean the legend of the Silver Wolf?" A heavy silence fell over the group. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to have diminished. "What legend is that?" Mark asked, his voice betraying a nervous curiosity. Daniel took a deep breath, his voice taking on a grave and hypnotic tone. "For generations it's been said that these lands are haunted by a creature half man, half wolf. The natives called it the Silver Wolf because of its fur that shines under the full moonlight." He paused, his eyes scanning the tense faces of his friends. "They say it was once a man, a hunter who got lost in these forests centuries ago. Desperate and starving, he made a pact with evil spirits, trading his humanity for the strength and ferocity of a wolf. But the price was high," Daniel continued, his voice now a whisper. "Every full moon, he transforms into a bloodthirsty beast, doomed to wander these forests eternally, hunting those unfortunate enough to cross his path." A branch snapped in the fire, making everyone jump. Sarah clung to Mark's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "This is ridiculous," Lucas said, but his voice trembled slightly. "Werewolves don't exist." Julia laughed nervously. "Of course not. They're just stories to scare tourists, right?" But Daniel's words had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. The wind howled through the trees as if in response to the story, and everyone instinctively moved closer to the fire. Well, Mark said, trying to sound nonchalant, at least we know we're safe. After all, werewolves only attack on full moon nights. And today... Oh. His words died as everyone looked at the sky, where the full moon shone relentlessly through a gap in the clouds, bathing the clearing in a spectral silver light. At that moment, a distant howl echoed through the forest, sending chills down everyone's spine. It was a sound that mixed the wildness of a wolf with something terribly human. The fear that had been a subtle presence now became palpable. The night, which already seemed long, promised to be endless. The howl that echoed through the forest left a heavy silence in its wake. The five friends looked at each other, faces pale in the flickering light of the campfire. "It must be just a regular wolf," Mark said, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. Sarah snuggled closer to him. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. "In the dark?" "No way," Lucas replied, his eyes nervously scanning the shadows beyond the circle of firelight. Julia stood up abruptly. I need to go to the bathroom," she announced, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't go alone," Daniel warned, his voice filled with concern. Julia forced a laugh. "Relax. I'm not a horror movie character. I'll be back in a minute." Before anyone could protest, she disappeared into the darkness, the beam of her flashlight wavering among the trees. Minutes dragged on. The tension grew with each moment that Julia did not return. "It's been too long," Sarah murmured, clutching Mark's arm. Daniel stood up. "I'll go look for her." "I'll go with you," Lucas said, surprising everyone with his sudden courage. The two men grabbed flashlights and ventured into the darkness, calling Julia's name. Mark and Sarah stayed behind, huddled near the fire, their eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. "Julia!" Lucas's voice echoed, followed by a bestial roar that chilled everyone's blood. Mark jumped to his feet. "Stay here," he shouted to Sarah, running toward the screams. Sarah, trembling uncontrollably, watched Mark's flashlight beam disappear among the trees. The sounds of struggle and screams were muffled by the dense vegetation, but still terribly audible. Then silence. Sarah huddled near the fire, tears streaming down her face. Minutes that felt like hours passed. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race. A figure emerged from the shadows. "Mark?" She stammered hopefully, but it wasn't Mark. Daniel stumbled into the clearing, his face pale as death, clothes torn and stained with blood. "Daniel, what happened? Where are the others?" Sarah asked frantically. Daniel fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. "Dead," he whispered. "They're all dead." "What? No, it can't be," Sarah screamed, the reality of the horror crashing down on her. Daniel grabbed Sarah's shoulders, his eyes wild. "We have to get out of here now. The creature, it's not human, it's not a wolf, it's something worse." A branch snapped in the darkness behind them. Daniel turned abruptly, his body tense. At the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the moonlight, was a monstrous figure, half man, half wolf, with silver fur glistening under the moonlight. Its yellow eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger, blood-stained fangs bared in a ferocious snarl. The silver wolf had found its prey. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but the sound got stuck in her throat. Absolute terror paralyzed her as the beast prepared to attack. The night of horror had only just begun. Time seemed to freeze as Sarah and Daniel faced the monstrous figure of the silver wolf. Its yellow eyes glowed with a primal hunger, saliva dripping from between razor-sharp fangs. Daniel was the first to react. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the dense forest. The creature's roar echoed through the clearing, followed by the sound of claws tearing into the earth as it launched into pursuit. Sarah and Daniel ran blindly through the darkness, branches whipping their faces and roots threatening to trip them with every step. "This way," Daniel gasped, pulling Sarah behind a large rock. They crouched, trying to control their ragged breaths, listening intently. For a moment everything was quiet. Then a piercing howl cut through the air, so close it made both their bones vibrate. It was a sound that blended the ferocity of a wolf with something terribly human, a lament of pain, fury, and insatiable hunger. Sarah stifled a sob, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "What was that, Daniel? What happened to the others?" Daniel closed his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. I saw it. That thing. It got Lucas first. I've never heard anyone scream like that." He swallowed hard, fighting nausea. "Mark tried to fight, but it was like facing 10 men at once. The creature threw him against a tree like he weighed nothing." "And Julia?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Daniel shook his head, unable to put the horror he had witnessed into words. Another howl echoed through the forest, this time farther away. Sarah and Daniel exchanged fearful looks. "It's playing with us," Daniel murmured. "Like a cat with a mouse." "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her trembling voice gaining a hint of determination. "We have to try to reach the road. Get help." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right, but we have to be careful. Very careful." They ventured back into the darkness, every sound amplified by their heightened senses. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of a branch, everything seemed to be the creature preparing to attack. Suddenly, Daniel stopped, raising his hand. "Did you hear that?" Sarah froze, straining her ears. At first she heard nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart. Then she caught it, a low rhythmic sound like breathing. Slowly, terrified, they turned. Less than 10 feet away, partially hidden by the shadows of an ancient tree, stood the silver wolf. Its silver fur glistened under the moonlight filtering through the treetops. Its eyes fixed on them were no longer just yellow. They now glowed with a cruel and very, very human intelligence. The creature took a step forward, its claws leaving deep grooves in the earth. Then, to Sarah and Daniel's absolute horror, it stood on its hind legs, its form shifting, contorting. Before them was no longer just a beast, but something between man and wolf, an abomination that defied nature itself. And then the creature spoke, its voice a guttural growl that still formed recognizable words. "Welcome to my forest. The hunt has only just begun." The howl that followed was not just a sound. It was a promise of unimaginable terror, echoing through the night and freezing the blood. In Sarah and Daniel's veins, the true nature of the horror they faced was finally revealed, along with the terrible realization that the night was far, far from over. Time seemed to freeze when the creature spoke. Sarah and Daniel were paralyzed, their minds struggling to process the impossible before them. The silver wolf, now a grotesque fusion of man and beast, smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Run!" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run!" They turned and plunged into the forest darkness, branches whipping their faces as they ran blindly. The creature's furious roar echoed behind them, followed by the sound of trees being knocked down in its relentless pursuit. Sarah stumbled, falling heavily. Daniel stopped to help her, but she screamed, "No! Keep running!" At that moment, the silver wolf burst into the clearing. Its form oscillated between man and beast, muscles writhing beneath skin and fur. Its eyes glowed with a cruel, hungry intelligence. Ignoring Sarah's protests, Daniel grabbed a thick branch from the ground. "Go!" he shouted to her. "I'll hold it off." "No!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. Daniel charged at the creature, swinging the branch like a club. The silver wolf roared in fury, its claws slashing through the air where Daniel had been a second before. Sarah watched in horror as Daniel danced a deadly waltz with the monster. Every blow he struck seemed futile against the creature's mass of muscle and fury. Then, in a movement too fast for the eye to follow, the silver wolf grabbed Daniel's arm. With a violent yank, it hurled him against a nearby tree. The sound of the impact was nauseating. "Daniel!" Sarah screamed, running towards her fallen friend. The silver wolf turned to her, its eyes gleaming with anticipation. But before it could strike, Daniel, bleeding and staggering, stepped between them. "Enough," he said, his voice weak but determined. "Leave her alone." The creature tilted its head, curious. When it spoke, its voice was a guttural growl. "Bravery or stupidity? Why sacrifice yourself for her?" Daniel smiled, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Because it's what makes us human." The silver wolf roared in fury, lunging for the final attack. But at that moment, Daniel pulled something from his pocket, the lighter they had used to light the campfire. With a swift motion, he lit the lighter and threw it at the creature's feet, where a trail of Sarah's spilled lantern fuel had left an inflammable path. Flames erupted instantly, engulfing the silver wolf. Its howl of pain and rage echoed through the forest, deafening. "Run!" Daniel shouted to Sarah, pushing her away. She hesitated for a moment, then ran, tears blurring her vision. Behind her, she could hear the horrible sounds of the struggle, growls, and the crackling of flames. Sarah ran as she had never run before, her heart threatening to explode in her chest. Branches and thorns tore at her skin, but she barely felt them. All that mattered was escaping, surviving. After what felt like an eternity, she burst onto the road. Headlights blinded her momentarily. A car was passing by. Sarah screamed and waved frantically. The car screeched to a halt. "Help!" she cried, running to the vehicle. "Please help me!" The driver, a middle-aged man with wide eyes of shock, opened the door. "My God, what happened to you?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. How could she explain the horror she had witnessed? At that moment, a distant howl echoed from the forest, a sound of pain, anger, and a promise. Sarah turned, looking into the impenetrable darkness of the trees. Her blood ran cold, for there, at the edge of the forest, two yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, watching, waiting. The hunt had ended, for now. Sarah got into the car, trembling uncontrollably. As the vehicle sped down the road, taking her away from that nightmare, she knew the memories of that night would haunt her forever. And somewhere in the forest, the silver wolf howled at the moon, its call a sinister promise that the terror was far from over. The rising sun painted the sky blood red as Sarah was taken to the local hospital. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, but it was the invisible wounds that tormented her the most. Hours passed in a blur of police questions, medical exams, and anguished phone calls from family members. Sarah mechanically repeated the story she had concocted. An attack by a wild animal, probably a bear. Who would believe the truth? As the day wore on, Sarah remained in a state of shock, her eyes fixed on the hospital window, watching the distant forest. Somewhere out there, she thought, her friends lay, or what was left of them. It was at dusk that the nurse entered, her face pale. "Miss Walker," she said softly, "there's someone here to see you." Sarah turned slowly, her heart nearly stopping when she saw who was at the door. Daniel. He stood supported by crutches, his body covered in bandages. His eyes, once full of life, now seemed empty, haunted. "Daniel," Sarah whispered, barely believing it. "How?" He hobbled into the room, collapsing heavily into the chair beside the bed. For a long moment they sat in silence, words seeming inadequate in the face of the horror they had shared. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice hoarse. "They found the bodies. Mark, Lucas, Julia. What's left of them?" Sarah closed her eyes, tears silently streaming down her face. "The police are calling it a wild animal attack," Daniel continued. "They think it was a bear or a pack of wolves." "But we know the truth," Sarah murmured. Daniel nodded slowly. "No one would believe it. Sometimes I can barely believe it myself. If it weren't for this." He pulled up his shirt sleeve, revealing 3 long parallel scars, claw marks that would never fully heal. Sarah reached out, gently touching the scars. "What happened after I ran? How did you survive?" Daniel looked away, his expression dark. I don't know exactly. I remember the flames, the fight. I thought I was going to die. Then darkness. I woke up in the forest at dawn, miles from where we were. My body felt different, stronger somehow. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "Daniel, do you think—" He cut her off sharply. "No, it can't be. I feel normal now. It must have been just adrenaline, the shock." But there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes, a fear of what might happen on the next full moon. At that moment a distant howl echoed, making them both freeze. It was impossible, Sarah thought. It couldn't be real, not in broad daylight. But when their eyes met, Sarah saw the same terror she felt, the silent understanding that the nightmare was far from over. Outside, the forest waited, dark and imposing, and somewhere in its depths a creature lurked, patient, hungry. The hunt might be over, but the curse had only just begun. Sarah held Daniel's hand, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him. Together they looked out the window, watching the sun set and give way to the shadows of night, and in the growing darkness 2 pairs of eyes glowed with a fear that would never leave them, for they knew, with terrifying certainty, that the silver wolf still roamed, and the full moon would rise again. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in the Black Pines forest. Autumn had arrived, painting the trees in fiery and blood-red hues, a constant reminder of the horror that Sarah and Daniel had faced. Sarah sat in her apartment, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the crescent moon in the night sky. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Daniel. "It's happening again. I need to see you. Now." With her heart pounding, Sarah grabbed her keys and left. As she drove to Daniel's apartment, her mind kept returning to that terrible night. The scars on her arms itched, a physical reminder of what they had survived. When she arrived, she found the apartment door ajar. "Daniel," she called, entering cautiously. The apartment was a mess, furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls, and in the center of the room Daniel was crouched, his body trembling violently. "Sarah," he gasped, looking up. His eyes were yellow. "It's happening. I can feel it." Sarah took a step back, fear freezing her veins. "Daniel, we can handle this. We can find help. There must be a cure." A low growl escaped Daniel's throat. "There is no cure," he said, his voice transforming into something inhuman. "Only the hunt." At that moment, the full moon emerged from behind the clouds, bathing the room in its silver light. Daniel screamed, a sound that turned into an agonizing howl. Sarah ran to the door, tears blurring her vision. Behind her, she could hear the horrible sounds of Daniel's transformation, bones cracking, muscles expanding, his humanity being consumed by the beast. She made it to her car, her hands trembling so much she could barely insert the key into the ignition. When she finally started the engine, she looked back at Daniel's apartment window. There, framed by the moonlight, was a monstrous figure, half man, half wolf. Its yellow eyes met hers, a flash of recognition passing through them before they were consumed by a primal hunger. The howl that followed was both a lament and a promise. Sarah sped away, leaving the city behind, knowing that her life would never be the same. As she drove down the dark road, the full moon hanging ominously in the sky, Sarah realized a terrible truth. The curse of the silver wolf had not ended that night in the forest. It had merely found a new host, and the hunt was just beginning. The horrific night in the Black Pines forest is just a dark chapter in the vast book of horrors that permeate our world. In every dark grove, in every seemingly tranquil town, ancient legends lie in wait, ready to awaken and challenge the fragile reality we've constructed around ourselves. The nightmare faced by Sarah and Daniel may have ended, but their scars, both physical and mental, are a constant reminder that the veil between our world and the supernatural realm is thinner than we'd like to believe. The howl of the silver wolf still echoes in the forest depths, a primal call that resonates in the darkest corners of our souls. But remember, dear readers, sometimes the true monster is not the creature hiding in the shadows, but the beast that sleeps within each of us, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The curse that turned a man into a werewolf is just one of the countless dark forces lurking at the edges of our understanding. Stay tuned for the next tale by Draven Nocturnus, where new night creatures, ancient curses, and unimaginable horrors await those brave or foolish enough to venture beyond the limits of the known. For in every dark corner, in every whisper on the wind, there may be a new terror waiting to be discovered. Always remember, when the full moon rises in the night sky, lock your doors, close your windows, and pray that the howls you hear are just the wind, and not something much, much worse. Until the next night of terror, my dear readers, sleep well, if you can,